When is the best time to work out? This was in the New York Times. The study suggests that exercising in the evening reduced the risk of death by 28%.
So let's take a look at the mortality data, right? So this is pretty interesting. People who, in my view, overstate the evidence for benefits, of which there are many of whom have no clue what they're talking about. You hear people all the time claim that intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating are longevity protocols or longevity interventions. Yeah, that's only if you calorically restrict. I think the question is whether or not evening exercise is better than afternoon or morning. And it looks like the effect is larger here, but my name is Matt Caberline, and welcome to the Healthspan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Healthspan podcast. I am joined once again by my trusty sidekick, Nick Arapis. And today for longevity this week, we have three stories that made the rounds within the last couple of months that Nick picked out. So if you don't like it, blame Nick. No, I think these will be pretty interesting. So one has to do with the effects of pregnancy on biological aging. One has to do with exercise and when you exercise, and does that impact longevity and health outcomes? And then the last one has to do with the effect of time-restricted feeding potentially on heart disease. So should be a fun conversation.
So the first one is titled, How Pregnancy May Speed Up the Aging Process. It was in the Washington Post. I believe you're mentioned in it. And it was written by Gretchen Reynolds. So a quick sidebar. So when you give a quote for an article like this, do they call you, email? Like, what's sort of the process?
Yeah, usually the writer will reach out, most often by email, unless it's somebody who I've had, an ongoing conversations with, and say, I'm working on this story about this topic. I'd love to chat with you, and when I can, and when it's something that I feel like I can talk intelligently about, I usually say yes if I can. And then not everybody, but many writers or publications will do a fact check afterward as well and just make sure that they get, the quote right and the meaning right.
I see. All right, so here's my summary I have from the article. So pregnancy may accelerate the aging process in women as studies on genetic markers and blood cells suggest cells age faster during pregnancy, potentially adding months or years to a woman's biological age. However, this process might reverse postpartum, especially with breastfeeding, though some research believe the changes could be temporary. A temporary response to pregnancy stress rather than true aging acceleration. That sounds like a pretty good summary of what...
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. So I think we're going to do this a little bit differently this time. I know you've had a chance to actually dive into the papers that the article is written about. And I mean, I think, that's a piece of advice that I give to everybody who feels like they can do that is whenever possible, take a look at the primary research and ask yourself, does it back up what the article is claiming or what the authors maybe are claiming if they do a press release? So I know you've had a chance to do that. Why don't you give us your take home from the papers around pregnancy and biological age?
Yeah, so pretty much the paper's claim was the number of times a woman has been pregnant correlates with their biological age increasing over time. So the higher that number, the higher the biological age.
Biological age measured how?
So they used 6 different tests. I actually have the list here. So they use Horvath, Hunnam, is that how you say it?
Hannum, yep.
Hannum, pheno age, Grim age, DNA, MTL, and the Dunedin pace. Dunedin pace.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, these clocks are a little bit different. So the Horvath clock is really, I think, the classic epigenetic clock. It's the one that I think most people default to. Some of these others like pheno age, actually the pheno age paper is pretty interesting. That was developed off of blood biomarkers, and then the pheno age epigenetic clock are epigenetic markers that correlate with the blood biomarkers that correlate with health outcomes. And then Dunedin pace is sort of a different flavor of clock where it is represents epigenetic changes that correlate with what's thought to be more representative of the rate of aging as opposed to biological age or epigenetic age. So in other words, you can find different epigenetic marks that are maybe predicting more how rapidly somebody is aging epigenetically, maybe biologically, versus epigenetic marks that are going to predict their actual biological age in a number. So pheno age is usually given as a fraction that's supposed to represent the rate at which you're aging biologically.
And do you think they chose a good mix, like having these different tests?
Yeah, I mean they're all, more or less commonly used in different studies. So yeah, I think this is a reasonable collection of different epigenetic clocks to use for sure.
Okay. So one thing I want to highlight too was there's no evidence for any effect on epigenetic age in men. So there's that for the partner.
Right.
So they took
And
blood.
that's actually, I think, that's actually important in the sense that if the hypothesis is that pregnancy is affecting biological aging, and I think maybe we'll talk about this, but due to the idea that there is a cost of reproduction in terms of longevity, you would expect that to be specific to women and not in men. So that actually, I think, is consistent with the hypothesis that this is a biological connection between pregnancy and biological age. Certainly doesn't prove it, but I think it's consistent with that. So it's actually interesting and perhaps informative that they did not see the same change in men.
Okay, so a few other details about the studies. It took place 2005 to 2014. They did blood tests, and they were pretty young mothers. So I think they were born like in the mid 80s.
And these were this was in the Philippines, right?
Yes, yeah, it was in the Philippines.
This is the PNAS paper because there were actually two papers around this that have both looked at this question, right? This is the more recent.
This is the PNAS, the one I believe came out. So, so for all clocks, women with at least one pregnancy were biologically older than women who had never been pregnant. All right, so the effect size of this study, they found that is about 4 to 14.2 months of accelerated aging. And so some more information is women who had more pregnancies between baseline 2005 and follow-up 2009 to 2014 had greater changes only in the Horvath test compared to the other ones. And so that was about 2.9 months of accelerated aging.
So that's specifically multiple pregnancies only showed larger changes compared to a single pregnancy in those two clocks and not in the others.
Correct, yeah.
Got it.
And the Hannum was 2.4 months as well, so pretty close. So was there anything else from this study that jumped out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that could impact the results was that I think most of the women in the study, I mentioned it was from the Philippines, and I think they were mostly from like low to middle income households. And so, I mean, you do wonder whether or not the potential for limited support, differences in healthcare could have played a role here. Again, that doesn't directly address whether or not pregnancy affects biological aging, but it certainly could be relevant for the amount of physical, emotional stress that these women were under as part of the pregnancy process. It's hard to know, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, so I do have a few questions for you. So big picture, I think this is what most people want to know. Does pregnancy or how does pregnancy accelerate biological aging?
I don't know is the answer.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think that is obviously the important question. The epigenetic clocks, as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, are only one trait that changes with age. They reflect part of biological aging. Is it reflecting a true acceleration of biological aging at the whole person or whole organism level? I don't think we know at this point. I think the one thing also to be aware of is these studies are done on blood samples. So what they're measuring is a signature of epigenetic age from blood. Presumably that's going to be mostly represented by immune cells. So you do wonder if this is a reflection of sort of overall biological aging or just changes in immune function, things like that go along with pregnancy. Having said that, I mean, I do think it is biologically plausible that the physiological stress that women experience during pregnancy is sufficient to cause changes that are similar to or maybe identical to accelerated biological aging. We know other aspects of stress can impact apparent rate of aging. Just think about the changes in, a president over 4 years or 8 years, right? Everybody's familiar with that idea. So it would not shock anybody if high levels of physiological stress accelerate the biological aging process. And so I think it is plausible that the physiological stress of pregnancy does have that impact, at least over the short term. I think this question of, is it a permanent change in biological age? I don't know. I think also, I tend to think of biological age in terms of resilience to stress. And so you might expect that what pregnancy really is a stress. So you are kind of shifting the physiology of the system temporarily. And then after that, you're going to see this restoration, which if you measured it by epigenetic age would look like an acceleration or an increase in biological age and then a rejuvenation. Again, is that really an increase in biological age or rejuvenation, or is it just something that kind of mimics the normal aging process? I don't know that we can answer that right now.
Let's say you had a woman who her primary goal was to optimize her health span. Would an article or reading something like this, do you think someone like that might not want to get pregnant?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I think there are there are both potentially negative and positive aspects to having many children, right? So I think that's impossible to answer at this point.
Yeah.
And I think trying to disentangle all of the positive things that go along with having a family and having children and the social impacts and the human connection piece, it's really hard to disentangle. So I would not want to suggest that there is any quantitative way to assess that at this point. You can certainly find data in the literature that women who have children tend to live longer and have a lot of health benefits. So I just don't think we know enough to be able to say anything about the short or long-term impacts on health span. And I mean, this may be getting ahead of things, but I think the punchline is I wouldn't change. If you want to have kids, have kids. If you don't want to have kids, don't have kids. I wouldn't change anything based on this paper for sure.
Yeah.
In terms of, the impact that this has on optimizing your health span or longevity.
That was sort of the takeaway from when I read it, is it felt like one step back for a little period of your life, but then two steps forward. And when you look at your life as a whole, in terms of adding longevity later.
Yeah, maybe. Again, I mean, I don't know that we actually have enough data to know for sure at the population level what the impacts on longevity or health span are of having children or number of children. And certainly we don't at the individual level, right? There's going to be a very individual thing in terms of the impact on your life trajectory. So again, my advice would be don't change what you're going to do based on this paper. There are lots of other more important things to consider when you're making the decision whether to have kids or not.
Okay, so the article did mention a trade-off between reproduction and longevity. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so this goes back to a theory in the field that I think is pretty well supported across many different animals, which is the idea that there's certainly a correlation between reproduction and longevity, or I should say an anti-correlation. What I mean by that is that reducing reproduction in many cases can increase lifespan, and many mutations that increase lifespan reduce reproduction. And there have been some molecular connections drawn between the signals from the reproductive system into longevity. This is best characterized in C. elegans, the nematode worm, where Cynthia Kenyon did some really fantastic work showing how signaling from the gonad and the reproductive system in hermaphrodite worms can increase or decrease longevity. So there's clearly cases where you can draw connections between reproductive signaling and longevity. The idea is, and this is where I think it gets a little hand wavy, the idea is, there's only a finite amount of resources that you can put towards either reproduction or longevity. And so when you increase reproduction, you decrease longevity. When you do the opposite, it goes the other way. That is overly simplistic. And so I don't think it's necessarily that these things are 100% coupled, but there are similar molecular pathways that affect both reproduction and longevity. So when you impact one, you can impact the other because they're controlled by similar pathways.
Okay, so this is when they talk about like certain sharks or whales that might not even start reproducing until they're 70. That would be an example of extreme.
So that's that's potentially a slightly different case where animals that reproduce very late, because of evolutionary reasons, they have to evolve longevity in order to be evolutionarily successful, right? The whole point of natural selection is to pass your genes on to the next generation. If you're not going to reproduce until you're 70 years old, you damn well better survive until you're 75 years old, or you are not going to be successful from an evolutionary perspective. So that may or may not have anything to do with the relationship between amount of reproduction and longevity. It's more of you have to evolve that longevity in order to be successful if you are reproducing late in life.
Or they wouldn't be in the gene pool.
That's right,
Yeah.
exactly.
All right, so my next question for you. So if pregnancy does accelerate biological aging, as indicated by the DNA methylation-based epigenetic clocks, what mechanisms might be involved?
Yeah, again, so I think this goes back to what we were just talking about, right? This coupling between reproductive signaling and longevity. And those are going to involve things like the growth promoting pathways that we know affect longevity, like growth hormone and insulin signaling and mTOR, right? Turning up those pathways is pro-reproduction, pro-growth. Turning them down, in general, is pro-longevity. So that's what I mean by those. They use the same machinery.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to decouple them. So Cynthia showed, and other people have shown as well, you can actually block the signal from the reproductive system to what we call the soma, the rest of your body, and no longer impact longevity. But because those things are coupled, it is often the case that when you perturb one, say turn up reproduction, you are at the same time turning down longevity.
That's interesting. All right, so next question. Why did we see a significant change in the Horvath and Hunnam clocks, but not in the other epigenetic clocks?
Yeah, I don't know. And this is a place where I will admit I have not spent the weeks that it would take me to really dive into the different clocks and exactly how they were built. And I actually think this is, first of all, it's good to admit your limitations to your knowledge, but I actually think this is a place where I have some concerns around the epigenetic clocks because I think the vast majority of people who are using them for studies like this have no freaking clue how they work. And when you have a very complicated tool that you don't understand how it works, that can cause you to misuse that tool. It can cause you to misinterpret that tool. So I'm actually kind of concerned about the proliferation of these epigenetic clocks when most people using them really don't understand the way they were built, and in particular, how to quality control the results that you're getting. So the answer is I don't know. There may be a good reason. It may have something to do with the way the clocks were trained, but the larger concern is that I don't think anybody who's really using these clocks, or very few people who are using these clocks these days, really understand how they work. And that means that there's very little quality control. And again, just to give a sort of concrete example, if you got data out of these clocks that made absolutely no sense, you might not even know it because you actually don't know how they're working, right? So I think the other thing I will say related to this is I do wonder how much of these kinds of studies are selection bias. And what I mean by that is, the people who see a result are going to publish it. If 10 people did this same study on 10 different populations and 8 of them saw no effect, or maybe saw a reduction in epigenetic age with pregnancy, maybe those would never get into the literature. So I do wonder how often we have a selection bias with these epigenetic clock studies where people are only publishing the things that fit the model that they were hoping would be the case when they started the experiment.
How long have the clocks been around?
Oh gosh, I think it's probably been 10, 12 years. I think the Horvath clock maybe first was published around 2013.
So the study was 2005, 2014?
Right. So these are going to be banked blood samples. And in fact, all of these clocks that have been developed as, biological aging clocks, the way that they're able to validate those clocks is by looking at what are called longitudinal studies where samples were collected from people over time. So they can look at the same person, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and then in large studies like NHANES, some fraction of those people will have died already, or they've developed heart disease or cancer. So that's how you can actually draw the correlations of these specific epigenetic changes to all-cause mortality or cancer. Because if you had to do it going forward, it would take you 20 years to validate a clock. So that's actually one of the weaknesses of the clock in my view, which is that nobody has actually shown it at the individual level. A measurement in you today is actually predictive for your health in the future. And one of the reasons to believe that these clocks may not work as well on data going forward is the environment that we all live in has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. So to the extent that environment affects longevity, which is, 80% of the effect, our environment is really different. So these clocks may not actually be as predictive going forward as they are in these sorts of, studies on banked samples. Looking backwards.
It'd have to be updated.
Yeah. So that explains why, though, this study said that it was from samples collected starting in 2005, even though the clocks hadn't been developed yet.
Okay, yeah, that answers that. So if you were to kind of put together your own study, or what kind of research would you want to see in this field to see the correlation between aging and pregnancy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be hard. So one thing to, I mean, I think the thing you would want to do is look at as many age-related traits as possible and see, are they all changing in the same direction? But I still think it's going to be difficult because the effects here were relatively small, from a few months to maybe a year. And most of these women are pretty young. So what does that really mean? What would we really expect to see change in a let's say 23-year-old woman to 24 that we would actually be able to measure? So I don't know how you'd really be able to do that part of it. I think more convincing would be a molecular understanding of what is causing the epigenetic changes that were reported here, and can we draw causal arrows from those epigenetic changes to the things that we are more confident actually directly affect biological aging, like the hormones that I talked about.
All right, so moving on. So the next article is when is the best time to work out? This was in the New York Times, and it's by Alexander Nazarian.
So what's your favorite time to work out?
I do really early. So I get in at into the building around 5:15, usually working out by 5:30. During COVID, it was kind of an idea. I had 3 months where the gym was shut, so I wasn't working.
Right.
10 a.m. was my ideal time. So
you find out you have the best workouts at that time, or that's just what fits your schedule best?
probably better workouts. We'll get into it, but it shows like having a consistent workout time, maybe body heat being a little bit higher. Yeah, I had my breakfast, I had my coffee, as opposed to kind of forcing it at 5:30. But you can get used to it eventually. Yeah. And if it wasn't 5:30, I'd have no other time to do it between.
Yeah, I'm all over the place. Whenever I can get it in. So I honestly am all over the place. Like some days it's the morning, some days it's after dinner, some days not at all. Yeah.
Well, one of the studies I'll talk about in a bit, but they talk about athletes with a consistent workout schedule.
Yeah.
If they always work out at noon, that's when they'd want to perform as well.
Yeah.
You kind of get used to that.
I don't know. I kind of feel like I have better resistance training workouts in the evening after dinner. I think for, something that gets my heart rate up closer to maximum, it's in the morning, but that's, just perception.
I think I would say it's similar for myself as well. But could you imagine just having the time though to schedule the program to do both? It would be tough.
I wish I had time to actually schedule it more. It's now whenever I can get it done.
You're getting it in. So, all right. So I'll read my summary for you. We'll see how close it is. So the study suggests that exercising in the evening, which is pretty late, we'll go over the times later, was the healthiest for individuals who were overweight. Their BMI was above 30, and a number of them had type 2 diabetes. It reduced the risk of death by 28%. That's sort of the big number from the study, compared to morning or afternoon workouts. Despite conflicting evidence and ongoing studies about the best time to work out, most people tend to emphasize whenever you can fit it in, what we were saying before.
Yeah.
So
any exercise is better than none, I think, is one take-home message.
Yeah, so I've got on screen here, we have sort of the big picture. I love how they did this as well. It made it so easy to look through the study. So we see they had almost 30,000 people in the study. About 3,000 of them had type 2 diabetes.
All right, so this was data from UK Biobank.
Yep, so here's the time breakdown. So 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. was considered morning. They also categorized working out as moderate to vigorous physical activity, so MVPA with the acronym.
Right.
And it had to be at least 3 minutes or more.
Right.
That's kind of their pretty limited criteria.
And there was a heart rate criteria in there too, I think.
Yeah, that they use say moderate or above it. There's a percent of your estimated heart rate max. So we got afternoon was 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. and then evening was 6 p.m. to midnight, which I thought was very late.
So how did they categorize people who had vigorous physical activity in all three buckets? I think it was just whichever category you had the most in.
Yeah, exactly. So they all had physical trackers on their dominant wrist.
Okay.
And it was whenever they had the most.
For a week, right?
Yep, for a week.
All right.
You remember how many people were in each one about? Or which one had the most?
Yeah, so my recollection, and this was something that I picked up on as potentially a complication here, was that the evening group had quite a fewer people compared to afternoon and morning. So it was like 6,000 to 7,000 in each of the other two groups, the morning and afternoon, and then the evening was like 2,000. So about a threefold less.
Okay. So a few more information is mean age was 62.2 plus or minus 7.7 years. The follow-up was again 7.9 plus or minus about 0.8 of a year. The total deaths during the duration were 1,425 cardiovascular disease. So about 3,980 events.
So let's take a look at the mortality data, right? So this is pretty interesting. This is all-cause mortality. I think it was kind of similar patterns for cardiovascular disease and microvascular disease. So most of the people fall in the no aerobic bouts. I mean, that's actually maybe not shocking, but the fact that in a week period, they didn't have a single 3-minute period of vigorous exercise, that's kind of disturbing. So that was 15,000 people. And that's what we're kind of baselining the mortality risk to. So all three groups have a reduction, but the reduction appears to be biggest in the evening exercisers. And here's the numbers. So as I was suggesting, the evening exercisers, there's about 2,000 people. Both of the other groups are larger. So, I mean, I look at this and I definitely believe that there is a reduction in all-cause mortality. And when you look at the other graphics for cardiovascular disease and microvascular disease, there's a reduction in those as well from exercise. I think the question is whether or not evening exercise is better than afternoon or morning. And it looks like the effect is larger here, but I wonder, is there something unique about the evening exercisers that's different from the morning and afternoon exercisers? I don't know the answer to that, but that's the obvious question.
Yeah, one hypothesis I saw was insulin resistance is pretty bad in the evening. It's pretty good in the morning, your insulin sensitivity. And so if you're someone who, like you mentioned, if you're eating after dinner or if you're working out after dinner, it could help lower that blood glucose response from dinner. So I want to go over I kind of wanted to look up other studies talking about workout timing. I found this one I liked quite a bit. So it was titled Best Time of Day for Strength and Endurance Training to Improve Health and Performance. So it's a little different. It's actually a meta-analysis. They looked at, I think, 14,000 articles and studies talking about workout timing. Their sort of main takeaway was that they found some benefit for working out at a consistent time. But again, that's in the lens of athletic performance.
Okay.
A couple quotes from the article, the Washington Post original article we're talking about. So whenever you can exercise, that is the answer. So I like that quote. And then they actually had an Arnold Schwarzenegger quote there at the end, which was, I will continue to train in the morning. It's automatic for me.
You need to say that in Arnold's accent.
Yeah. Schwarzenegger. So, I mean, again, the idea
Maybe we need to have Arnold on the podcast at some point.
Yeah, dream guest. Right behind Peter Attia. So I'll continue to train in the morning. So automatic for me. What I liked about that was it's like the same way you brush your teeth in the morning. It just, with him, it's just this habit.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a takeaway.
Yeah. And I mean, again, the data I think are indicative that exercise any time of the day is beneficial. So that absolutely, I would completely agree with that. I mean, I do think it is intriguing that exercise in the evening might give you even a larger bump in mortality and at least cardiovascular diseases. And there are some, mechanisms that you could plausibly connect to that. I just think, this study alone is not convincing for sure, I would say.
So I guess my first question for you is, if you want to kind of go out on a limb, what do you think those mechanisms would be?
Yeah, well, I mean, the things you would think about are glucose metabolism and insulin response. I mean, I think that, there is certainly some thought that eating very late in the day leads to higher blood glucose levels at night. You might speculate that people who are working out late in the day are less likely to eat a big meal late in the day. You could also make the opposite speculation. Some people like me get hungry after they work out and are more likely to eat later in the day. But you might think that you would have better glucose homeostasis at night on average, especially in an obese, potentially diabetic population. You're going to have better glucose response at night by exercising in the evening. I guess that's something we didn't actually emphasize, is this was an obese population of which a significant fraction was diabetic. It certainly is possible that exercise in the evening is preferentially beneficial in an obese and or diabetic population and not in a metabolically healthy population. And if that's the case, the likely explanation has to do with glucose metabolism at night. So I think that's a reasonable speculation. Again, this study did not actually show that the evening exercisers have improved glucose metabolism at night. So that would be kind of a next step, would be a more directed study where you actually look at potential downstream mechanism. That's probably the most likely and most plausible explanation. You might also speculate that sleep quality would be impacted. Now, I know some people are concerned, and I've heard people say that exercising at night can negatively impact sleep quality. That's probably an individual thing. I know for myself personally, if I do a really good resistance workout in the evening, I tend to sleep better because my muscles are tired. So, I think the idea of whether or not exercise in the evening negatively or positively impacts sleep is probably going to be individual, Probably also depend on the kind of exercise you're doing. Might depend on the kind of exercise you're doing. Those would be two obvious things I would think about, though.
Yeah, I mean, I just grew up in sort of the pre-workout, coffee before. So I just the idea of working out in the evening with not with no coffee or no caffeine just doesn't speak to me. I kind of like coupling the two.
Got to get rid of the crutch, man.
I know it's tough. And there's some arguments I've heard people say for morning work. Like one in particular is your hormones, like testosterone, peaks in the morning. So people say that's a good reason to work out that time.
I mean, again, that's plausible. I think it depends a little bit also maybe on what the goal is, right? So for performance, yeah, maybe. For if you want to bulk up, yeah, maybe. If you want to live longer and have less heart disease, maybe not. Like, I mean, I don't know, but it could depend on what the outcome is that you're most interested in. And you really, in these kinds of studies, you really have to look at what was measured. If they're measuring performance, that could be different than what is optimal for health or long-term health or longevity.
So through that lens, what kind of study would you want to see?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think, so there's a couple things. I think this study is limited by the cohort, right? So obese, enriched for diabetics. If that's the cohort you're interested in impacting, it's the right study. If you're interested in the relative effects of timing of exercise on health in non-obese, non-diabetic people, you need to look in a non-obese, non-diabetic population. So that would be one different study that would be important to do. And I think it would be interesting to know what is the actual impact in both of those types of populations on, say, glucose homeostasis overnight versus, people who work out in the morning versus work out at night. That would be one thing that would be pretty easy to measure. Sleep quality as well. Just put Oura rings on people or other devices to measure sleep quality and quantify sleep quality relative to time of day of workout. Now, if you really want to do it well, you'd want to have them do exactly the same kind of exercise, same amount of time, same intensity, right? Probably have the same people, for a week they work out in the morning, a week they work out at night, do a crossover design. There's all sorts of ways you could do this to make the data stronger. But the limitations to those kinds of studies is they're going to be smaller and for shorter time periods. Yeah. So I think you optimally would want a mix of, directed short-term studies that are very well controlled with these kinds of larger epidemiological population-based studies.
Okay, so they'd have an activity tracker, they'd have a CGM, I assume.
Yep.
You said. And do you think to standardize diet or anything? Does that matter?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, it depends on the kind of study you want to do. But if you really wanted to know what is the impact of time of day on glucose metabolism overnight, yeah, you'd want to have everybody eating the same, as much as possible, same diet.
Okay. So other than what we already talked about, which is work out the best time for you, like whenever you can make it a habit, are there other sort of factors you'd want to take into play when someone's choosing a workout time, or does it not really matter to you?
I mean, again, I'm not convinced that there is a big difference in time of day. So number one, just make sure you can get the workout in, right? Mm-hmm. And if you feel like you get better workouts in the morning and you can fit that into your schedule, maybe that makes more sense, or vice versa. But again, this is kind of like the pregnancy study. I wouldn't change what you're doing. If you have a successful exercise routine, I wouldn't change it based on this particular study.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. So third and final study. So this one's titled "The Intermittent Fasting Trend May Pose a Risk to Your Heart." So pretty big title there. The Washington Post, and it's by Anahad O'Connor.
And I was not quoted in this article, right?
You weren't? No, unfortunately not.
No, it's fine.
This one caught a lot of heat, so maybe it's good that you weren't quoted in it. So I'll read my summary for you, then we kind of hop into it. So a study presented at the American Heart Association meeting suggested that adhering to an 8-hour eating window, so doing a bit of fasting, may increase the risk of dying from heart disease by 91%, so a big number, compared to a traditional dietary pattern. Even among those with chronic diseases or cancer, while the study highlights a correlation between time-restricted eating and increased mortality, it cannot establish causation, of course, and some critics argue that intermittent fasting may overlook diet quality and long-term health impacts. So pretty good summary of what you read as well.
Yeah, the only thing I might expand on is the terminology. And again, this is where I think intermittent fasting gets used differently by different people. And even in your description, you called it intermittent fasting once, and I think time-restricted eating once. So just for the purposes of clarity, I'm going to define this is time-restricted eating. So eating in a limited window in every 24-hour period is time-restricted eating. Intermittent fasting, I define as not eating for at least 24 hours and doing that periodically, right? So I just think it's important because those are potentially two very different nutritional interventions. And so it's worth being clear what we're talking about. So I think this study only looked at time-restricted eating, and it was a window of 8 hours
That
or
was the
less?
smallest window. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so I'll go over some of the details of the study. So the study included approximately 20,000 adults in the U.S. with an average age of 49 years old. Study participants were followed for a median length of 8 years and a maximum length of 17 years. And the study included data from NHANES participants who were at least 20 years of old at enrollment, and they started between 2003 and ended in 2008. So kind of before the fasting trend, in my opinion, took off.
Right.
And they completed 2 24-hour dietary recall questionnaires within the first year of enrollment.
Right. So these are presumably mostly people who were doing time-restricted eating, not for potential health benefits, but because for one reason or another, that's the paradigm that they had adopted.
Oh, correct. Yeah, exactly. All right. So we'll go over a few more numbers. So people in the less than 8 hour a day group, there's 414 of them. People in the 12 to 16 hour a day group, there was 11,831. So quite a bit more people.
Yeah. This is like the last study, although this is even more skewed in terms of a very small number being in one group and a much larger number being in the other group.
Exactly. Yeah. For a total of around 20,000 people, and when you add in the third group as well. So a couple interesting facts I found: 20% of the less than 8 hour group they smoked, where 16.9% of the 12 to 16 hour group smoked. So there's quite a bit. There's a lot more smokers in the less than 8 hour group, which I found interesting. We can go into that more details in a bit. And also, they had the highest BMI. So the less than 8 hours a day eating group had a 29.9 BMI, which is 0.1 away from obese. Here's a tweet that you posted. Do you want to read it? Want to read your tweet? You want me to read it?
You go ahead to read it.
All right. In your voice?
Yeah. You got to use my accent.
All the influencers are losing it over the new report that intermittent fasting, you just called it intermittent fasting, is associated with a 91% increase in heart disease death. Obviously, many caveats and not published yet, so don't know what the other flaws may exist. That was interesting, too, how they posted this before it was published.
That happens sometimes when things get presented at meetings.
Okay. It kind of leaks in a way? Or
No. You present it publicly so people can talk about it. And sometimes articles will get written. Sometimes, press releases will be put out based on unpublished data that's only presented at a meeting. It happens all the time.
Okay. All right. So you continue to say, but this seems like a pretty big effect and probably worth not ignoring completely. Just because we don't want to believe it is true.
Actually, just because you don't want to believe it.
It's because you don't want to believe it.
I was talking about the influencers that were losing it. So honestly, look, okay, this study has a lot of problems. I would not draw any strong conclusions from this study. I was really trying to poke a bit at the people who, in my view, overstate the evidence for benefits from intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, of which there are many, many of whom have no clue what they're talking about. And so this was really just an effort to say, hey, guys, here's some evidence that runs counter to what you're trying to sell. I know you're going to ignore it, and I'm making fun of you. So that was really what this tweet was about, because so many people just ignore anything that doesn't fit their worldview. And I do think it is worth, when you see something like this, it is worth paying attention and doing something like, what we're doing, and actually taking a closer look and asking yourself, is there anything here that is potentially suggestive, or can I just throw it out the window because this is such a poorly designed study that's not even worth talking about? And I do think this is not the first study to suggest that there may be some counterproductive effects associated with intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating. And so that was really why I put that up.
Okay.
Really,
so,
just to
poke the bear.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
So I'm not on Twitter, but did you get a lot of retweets, a lot of responses?
I don't know. I don't pay any attention.
So you got to post and ghost.
I mute the people who annoy me.
Okay, there we go. I was just curious if you had a lot of,
Probably. I honestly don't remember.
All right, so I got a few questions for you. So the first one is, what were some of the limitations, shortcomings you saw in the study personally?
Yeah, I think so. There were quite a few that I think limit interpretations. Not necessarily the author's fault; it's the data set that they've got. But I think we already talked about the difference in group sizes. So the fact that the 8 hour time-restricted eating group was so much smaller than the other groups, opens it up to potential biases within that group from a relatively small number of people. So that's a little bit of a concern. The differences in smoking rate, I think, are telling. And, maybe that's not shocking that people who smoke, especially people who smoke a lot, might eat in a much shorter window. I certainly still know some people who smoke and smoke a lot, and I think they do tend to actually smoke instead of eating. And then if they're eating the same amount, which this suggests that these people are, because their BMI was actually, I think, higher than the other groups, or at least comparable. So if you're shrinking how much you're eating in terms of time, but eating as much or more as you would if it was expanded, and smoking, it wouldn't be shocking if there were some negative health consequences associated with that. And so I think all of those things suggest that the idea that it's only the window of eating that's driving the negative health consequences, that's probably a oversimplification. And so I would not, from this, if you're using time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting to maintain a healthy body weight, I wouldn't necessarily change what I was doing based on this. The other piece is we really don't know what the quality of the diet was that these people had. And again, you might speculate that people who are smoking and cramming all their food into a short window but still overeating are probably eating a relatively low quality diet, which obviously could also impact health risks. So I think all of those things limit the ability to actually, I mean, you should always be careful about drawing causal assumptions from this kind of data, but even more so in this case.
Okay, so my sort of takeaway, like what I felt reading the study, was you have someone who's for health reasons is trying, okay, I'm going to eat in this window to reduce my total calories for the day, whatever it is. These people didn't seem like that. They seem to me like people who are maybe working 2 jobs, kids.
Yeah, that's also
stress.
possible, right? And I don't think we have any information about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
you could ask yourself, are there other reasons why they were reducing the amount of time in each day that they were eating? And yeah, you could speculate all sorts of stuff that could be driving some of this. Yeah,
because they had the 91% increase in heart disease, so it makes you think there's other things going on as well, of course. But so could you walk me through a potential mechanism by which time?
Actually, let me add one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't remember what the other demographics they had on this group is, but you do also sometimes see people who are frail and sick don't eat as much. And they sleep a lot more. So especially very elderly people. I don't think this group, was particularly elderly, but you often see this in the very elderly or people, maybe even in their 60s who are quite unhealthy. They sleep a lot, and so they're only awake for maybe 10 hours a day, right? Or out of bed. And so they naturally kind of compress the window that they're eating in simply because they're only up and active for a shorter window of time. So that may also be something here that could skew even if only 10% of the people were, when you only have 400 people in your group,
True, yeah.
That could have a pretty big impact on the outcome. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of reasons that we could come up with for maybe why this is a sort of an artifact of the cohort rather than a cause of time-restricted eating. Again, that's all speculation. Could also be that time-restricted eating actually does increase risk of heart disease. So I wouldn't want to completely rule it out. I would just say this is weak evidence for that.
So your frustration is more so people cherry-picking studies to support what they want, like to support time-restricted eating.
Not only cherry-picking, but completely misrepresenting the actual data. So the actual data from laboratory studies are very clear. There is, in my view, no compelling evidence that time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, once you control for caloric consumption, have benefits on longevity or health span. At least not large benefits, maybe a teeny tiny benefit. So you hear people all the time claim that intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating are longevity protocols or longevity interventions. Yeah, that's only if you calorically restrict, and that's only in laboratory animals. And we really don't know that that's not all caloric restriction, and you couldn't get all of those benefits from calorically restricting without doing time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting. So there's just a massive misrepresentation of the actual data, which is frustrating to me. That's the problem that I've got. And then the human data is very mixed, right? The data on time-restricted eating in humans, I actually would say you can find more evidence that it has a zero or negative effect than you can find evidence that has a positive effect in people for time-restricted eating. Intermittent fasting, I think you can find some evidence for sure that when people lose weight, that there can be health benefits associated with intermittent fasting. And most people, if they do true intermittent fasting, will not overeat enough on the days that they're eating to make up for the fasting days.
Okay. All right. So there's no real like special mechanism happening that can increase biomarkers other than caloric restriction.
Yeah, well, so you can speculate for sure. And I mean, so this is where I think the people who misrepresent the data can sort of get away with it, because you can come up with biologically plausible mechanisms where intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating could have benefits independent of caloric consumption. And I'm not saying they don't, I'm just saying the data that's out there don't support that convincingly. The mechanisms you might point to with time-restricted eating, there is pretty good evidence in mice that time-restricted eating can positively strengthen the normal circadian rhythms, which seem to degrade somewhat with age. Okay, so if it is and so just for people who maybe aren't familiar with this idea, all that we mean by circadian rhythm is the normal 24-hour patterns that some genes show in the way that they are turned on or turned off. So some genes go up and down in a 24-hour pattern. That's the circadian rhythm. And it's pretty strong when we're young, and then at least in some animals, that seems to get weaker as we get older. And time-restricted eating, if it's done within the normal circadian pattern, can seem to strengthen that signal. So is that beneficial for longevity? I don't know. It seems to be at least partially important for the longevity benefits of caloric restriction in mice. Maybe it's important in people, but you can point to that. And then with intermittent fasting, and again, we're talking intermittent fasting fasts of more than 24 hours, people will point to changes like reductions in IGF-1, improved insulin sensitivity, maybe activation of autophagy. It's a little bit unclear how long you have to fast to see significant activation of autophagy. So there are biologically plausible mechanisms that fasting will engage that are associated with longevity in laboratory animals. Again, the question there is, if you were to eat enough on the non-fasted days to make up for what you didn't eat on the fasted days, would that counteract all the benefits you get from engaging those mechanisms? Probably is my guess. This is where, again, does it come down to caloric restriction, or is it fasting, or is it the combination of the both? And I think you can find evidence in the literature that you don't need to fast to get significant benefits from caloric restriction. It wouldn't shock me if you got larger benefits from caloric restriction if there was also a period of fasting. So I know that's complicated, but it's important to be precise in what we're talking about, because so many people aren't.
Okay. So
and it's confusing to people.
So if you have someone who, say, they're currently doing time-restricted feeding or eating and they want to move on to a more traditional or different way, what sort of advice would you have for that person?
Yeah, I mean, my view is diet quality is more important than when you eat, for sure. And I'm certainly not comfortable recommending time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting and not paying any attention to diet quality. I think some people use intermittent fasting as a little bit of a crutch to maintain body weight so that they think they can eat whatever they want. And I think that's probably actually counterproductive. So what I would say is focus on diet quality first. If you find that eating a quality diet in combination with time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting is a useful tool to maintain healthy body weight, great. That's better than not maintaining a healthy body weight. Is it better than maintaining a healthy body weight not doing that? I don't know. I'm skeptical, but maybe. But I think still quality is better than time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting when you eat. What you eat is more important than when you eat. So that would be sort of my initial thoughts. The other thing is that I kind of harp on is, if you are on a caloric restriction diet and you are actively losing body weight, you really want to make sure that you are counteracting the trend to lose lean mass and bone density by engaging in resistance exercise for sure. And I would suggest probably eating a higher protein diet, certainly while you're losing weight. So that's my own sort of personal view on it. And from my own experience, that has worked pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. Similar advice for people taking GLP-1 agonist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, GLP-1 agonists are really a way to induce caloric restriction. It's pretty much that simple. The people who lose weight on a GLP-1 agonist are eating less. That's why they're losing weight. I think the concern is that what we have seen is many, maybe most people taking the GLP-1 agonists also lose lean mass, probably also lose bone density, although maybe it's in the literature, I haven't really seen that quantified as much. And that's because when these drugs at least first started being deployed, at a larger scale, physicians were not giving people the strong recommendation that they needed to engage in resistance training and probably increase their protein consumption.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. So one of the biggest complaints I saw about this was people say dietary recall surveys are close to useless. Do you have an opinion on that?
I mean, I think it depends on the context. I think in this case, it's probably, I would expect these are probably pretty accurate. Like, I think most people are going to know whether or not they are eating outside of an 8-hour window or not. Like, I would not be as concerned in a study like this as I would be if you're asking people to recall exactly what they eat for each meal over, 10 years ago or something like that.
Because they only need to remember when they ate, when they stopped eating.
Yeah, and I think most people have a pattern, right? Most people know roughly what time they get up, what time they go to bed. Do they eat within a couple hours before going to bed? Do they eat right away when they get up? It's not going to vary a lot from day to day for most people, I'm guessing. So I'm not so concerned about that in this study.
All right, so I kind of wanted to go over recapping the last three things. So for the three main articles we looked at today, how do you feel about the Washington Post and New York Times, their choice of headlines? It's kind of like gut feeling, or if you call it something different. So the first one was how pregnancy may speed up the aging process.
It's got may in there. It's okay, I guess. I mean, again, the thing that I usually fixate on with these kinds of things is if they called it biological aging and they only measured epigenetic age, I think that's an overstatement. I'm trying to remember the article. I actually think the author was pretty specific in the text of the article that this was epigenetic age, may have slipped up and called it biological aging a couple of times. But that would be the thing I would more focus on here than anything else. I think it's it's designed a little bit to get people to click, but it doesn't say anything that's not, that's wrong.
Yeah, okay, I agree. I think it's well done. So the next one is, when is the best time to work out?
Same thing. I mean, again, except here, I think that's it's a question. Like, again, it's designed to get people to click, but it's asking a question.
Yeah. When I read that one, I think, I want to know the best time to work out for athletic performance, as a 32-year-old.
Yeah.
When I read that, really it should have asterisks if you're obese and diabetic.
Well, let me ask you something. As a 32-year-old, why are you more concerned about athletic performance versus how healthy you're going to be for the rest of your life?
Good point. I guess recently I've kind of shifted more to what you said, that mentality. But at one point, maybe 10 years ago, it would have been more important.
Yeah.
When it's college and in summer quarter and I only have one class.
Yeah. But again, it really, for most people, I get it totally. I'm still kind of the same. I think we're all kind of driven. You want to do better. You want to lift more. You want to go faster. I get it. If you're playing a game, you want to win. But if you're not a competitive athlete, like what really is more important, right? Increasing your bench or optimizing your health span. And I'm not saying those are even necessarily different strategies to get there, but it is worth thinking about, like, where are you putting your focus and your energy and your education? And certainly some people do counterproductive things to perform better that in the long run are harmful to their health. And again, unless you're a competitive athlete, why would you do that? I understand why, but it's worth thinking about. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I totally fit into that mold now, where I do less weight training than I probably want to do and a bit more cardio because I know I kind of need to balance it a bit. Where at one point it was powerlifting, 250 pounds, body weight, kind of all weight training. Yeah. So last one is, the intermittent fasting trend may pose a risk to your heart.
Yeah, I kind of like this title, but that's because of my pushback against intermittent fasting and time restricted eating misinformation. It's a little overstated. Again, it had may in there, but yeah, it's a little bit overstated.
Okay. All right. So any closing thoughts on what we went over today, or do you feel like?
No, I think this was a pretty good collection of different articles related to longevity that touch on topics that I think most people are going to be interested in. So good job selecting the articles, and I thought it was fun.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So thanks for watching the Optispan podcast. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you are not yet a subscriber, what the hell is wrong with you? Click that subscribe button, baby. And I hope to see you next time on the Optispan podcast.